what we're going to do today, a few things. We're going to dive into exploring and defining what is Qual-at-Scale. From that definition, we're going to look at some criteria to evaluate different approaches. And then we're going to actually go through the 5 leading approaches that we've seen out there that our customers are using or that we ourselves have used in the past. All of this geared towards giving you some frameworks and some ways of thinking about how to get the most out of Qual-at-Scale. Before I go there, I just want to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, where Fathom's coming from, as that will give you a sense of what you're seeing, what you're hearing from us when we get into the recommendations. But the bulk of today is actually not going to be about them. It's going to be focused on overall approaches to getting deep insights at scale. So I come to this work as a combination of a researcher and a technologist. As a researcher, I've led research for everything from Fortune 100s to presidential campaigns to everything in between. With Tova, we co-founded a research agency before Fathom, actually, and all that we did was Qual-at-Scale. We were very successful in doing that. That agency was actually acquired last year. And from that experience, we learned that text analytics were really the linchpin to understanding people at scale. You can collect the data a bunch of different ways, but at the end of the day, you really need to understand the words that people are saying in depth, detail, nuance, and context in order to deeply understand people at scale. And so that led to Fathom, which is really the other part of the perspective that I bring today as someone who has spent a number of years really deep in the technology of how we do this. Of course, artificial intelligence being a major component of this, but all the other tools and systems of how to really understand people at scale. So both a researcher and a technologist bringing that perspective to what it is we're doing today. In terms of Fathom, I'll just give you a quick intro before we get into the bulk of the content around navigating the quality landscape scale. But as you may know, what we do at Fathom is understand people in their own words via text analysis. So what makes us really different is the level of detail and nuance of the analysis that we're able to do. As researchers, our experience was that the other tools that were out there were just not getting us the level of detail. They weren't accurate. We would look at, anything from a word cloud to automated AI insights. We'd sort of look at the themes it was giving us. We'd look at the raw data and we'd say, this just isn't good enough. It's not really giving me the themes that I want. It's not giving me the themes I want. It's not giving me the insights I need. And so that led to us building our own tool. And it's really designed to maximize the level of detail, nuance, and adaptiveness of the themes that you're getting in the data to really get to that point where what you're seeing are the themes a human researcher would see in the data. The way we're able to do that is by combining cutting edge artificial intelligence. So yes, we partner with OpenAI, with Anthropic, with Microsoft, with Amazon, and others, as well as our own in-house models, very high firepower AI, but we also have built a really unique human in the loop system such that there are expert human researchers who are reviewing the labeling process and therefore ensuring an exceptionally high quality level of data and detail, and most importantly, customization of the themes to your data. And so it's that human in the loop approach. It's very different than any other tool out there that gets us the quality of human analysis at the scale that only AI can achieve. So that's a bit on Fathom. Tova mentioned, we've been at this for a while. We have worked with very high caliber researchers across market research through to public opinion polling. We've done tens of millions of responses and have really validated this approach. And at the end of the day, what we found is that if you want to deeply understand people at scale, understanding the words is what really matters. And the way that you do that is translating those words into text and then carefully analyzing people in their own words. So having said all that, what I'd love to do is take us into the bulk of today's presentation. I'm also going to move through this relatively quickly. We've packed a ton of content in here to try to make this as valuable as possible for you. That means I'm going to move a little bit quickly because I also want to make sure that we get to questions and conversation at the end. We've got a lot of folks on the line here with a ton of experience as well. So I'm hoping that we can have a bit of a conversation at the end. As we go through, there's a Q&A function. So please do drop in questions about questions from other folks. And we'll go through those at the end in about 30 minutes or so as we get through this. So the way that we're going to spend our time today, we're going to start with defining Qual-at-Scale. This was a question that came in. I think it's one of the most important things. It sounds great, but what do we actually mean? And that's really critical to then be able to evaluate why we want it, when we want it, what types of approaches are going to be the best to get to it. From that definition, we're then going to actually look at 5 key metrics so that we can actually evaluate different approaches. How much are we getting the qualitative things we want? How much are we getting the scale things we want, given any approach? We're then going to look at 5 particular approaches. These are what we're seeing most commonly used by customers. So Fathom is really sort of has a front row seat to many of these different approaches because our customers are using, in fact, many, if not all of them, and then collecting the text and processing it after the fact with Fathom. So we're able to see where customers are getting the most value from these different approaches. And as I mentioned, of course, we ourselves have had a ton of hands-on experience using these as well as researchers. So what we're going to show you are 5 broadly characterized approaches. We'll name drop a few tools and companies within those areas, but we're really focusing on what we're seeing most prevalently. We're not going to be able to cover everything, but I think we're going to look at 5 that are really helpful for how you think about designing your research stack as you go. Next, we're going to look at some trade-offs. As we go through those, we're going to reveal that there really are sort of 2 categories of scale and qual that lean more towards the qual or more towards the scale. And there's really a key question that you want to keep in mind in terms of choosing which one's going to be most useful for you. And finally, we'll provide our recommendation. Again, we built a whole company that did this. We've spent most of the last 10 years looking at how to scale qual. And so we'll share with you what we have found to be most of the time the biggest bang for buck, the best way to do this, understanding that, in different cases, different approaches may outweigh that depending on what you need. So let's dive in. Let's start with the definition. So I like to keep our definition simple. In this case, we're going to define Qual-at-Scale as a methodology, an approach that allows for the collection and analysis of open-ended responses from 50 or more research participants. So let's break that down a little bit. Why I'm focused on open-ended responses here is that in my view, that really is the key to the qualitative component of research, is asking someone an open-ended question. That can happen in a lot of different contexts. It can happen in an interview, in a focus group, in a survey, in any number of emerging online platforms. But it's that open-ended question that gives us free-form responses that are really the key to what we want from qualitative, which I'll get into it in a second. So we want open-ended responses. And in terms of scale, I wanted to try to keep this sort of most accessible. So at least 50 respondents. So we could include a broader range of tools. Many folks might say that's not really scale, but I think it's at least a lower limit at which, depending on your research needs, you're looking at something more than a handful of interviews, more than a single focus group. You're starting to get a reasonable amount of scale in terms of the responses that you're gathering. A lot of the tools we're going to look at would do 10, 100, 1,000 times X, that lower threshold, but we wanted to keep it broad. Finally, I'll note that this definition is medium agnostic. So there's a lot of tools out there that are really focused on the ways through which they're collecting these open-ended responses. Maybe it's an audio-based survey or a text or a video testimonial. There's lots of different pros and cons to those in terms of audience engagement. My view as a researcher is at the end of the day, those collapse down to text that is then analyzed. And so you might prefer a different collection mechanism, but at the end of the day, it's really about how well are you able to collect those open-ended verbatim responses across different audiences and what are the trade-offs of how that's done. So that's our working definition. I want to stop for a second on why we want it, because I think we're seeing a lot of bubbling interest in Qual-at-Scale. As I mentioned, this is something Tova and I have been working on for a long time, and it's easy to just sort of say, yeah, that sounds great. Because at the end of the day, we as researchers have had this forced trade-off for decades, if not forever, between quantitative methods that get us scale, representativeness, the ability to understand frequency rigorously, and qualitative instruments that get us depth, they let us understand the why, we get nuance and detail. And we've never really been able to merge the two. And so we build research programs that sort of move between the two and discover with qual and validate with qual and all of those things. But at the end of the day, what we really want, what I always wanted as a researcher, is to deeply understand people and then know that that takeaway that I had, I could trust because it was at scale that was representative, and therefore I could take action on it. So the promise here is really kind of the holy grail of research, to deeply understand people at scale. But we want to get a little more detailed of a definition than that in terms of why we want it, because it helps us understand which approaches in which cases are going to be most helpful for us. So on the qualitative dimension, what we really want, of course, is discover the unexpected, right? So if I do a logo test and I say, hey, here's a logo for some cybersecurity company, I want to see what are all the different ways people react to that and just see open-ended, and people are going to have wild reactions I didn't expect. I also want depth and detail. If I say, why are you canceling your subscription to this company? I want to know not just pricing. I want to know, hey, it's because you raised your prices 4 times in 1 year and inflation is crazy and I just lost my job, and like all the detail and nuance, all that richness gives me a lot more detail and information. And of course, the why. This is the critical thing that is difficult to compute. We've worked with a number of Fortune 100 companies that have incredibly powerful quant teams, and they've said, look, we know the what incredibly well, but the why is our problem right now. And that's where we turn to qualitative, right? So that's what we really want is those three things. Scale, this might seem obvious, but I want to really emphasize this first point here is that when we say we want scale, in my view, what we really are saying is that we want to have confidence in the frequency of the themes we're identifying in the population. So let's say we did a focus group and I was doing that logo test, and someone in the focus group said, hey, that logo reminds me of a baby penguin. I think that's ridiculous for this big buff cybersecurity company. If I look at that, I say, okay, that's 1 in 10 people in a room. Is that really representative of our audience? I don't know. Well, I need a bigger sample. And the reason I want a bigger sample is to be able to say, hey, is it, 1 in 10, or is it a fraction of that or a multiple of that that are having this particular reaction to the content, similar of any other research question I might have? That's what scale really gives us, is to say, hey, I've got this takeaway, this insight, this conclusion that's coming up in terms of the frequency with which the audience is having some kind of reaction or making some kind of choice or making some kind of statement. If I want to be confident that it is X percentage of people and therefore basic decision on it, I need that level of scale. Of course, I need a representative sample. And if I'm going big enough, I can then segment down. I can say not only, hey, we've looked at 10,000 responses for why people say they're canceling. We have confidence in the top 25 themes that people are stating. We can also then drill down more into new users versus old users, so on and so forth with that segmentation analysis. So those are all things that scale gives us as well. So ideally, from a scale qual program, we want a combination of these things. And so as we go into the criteria, what we're really going to be looking at is how can we build a system to deeply understand people at a scale we can trust. That's really what we're aiming for here. So let's look at the criteria. I'm going to reiterate these with each approach that we go through, so I won't dwell on them too much. But I think it's helpful to look at the various approaches in terms of 5 drivers of performance or value. So the first one that I would focus on is depth of language analysis. So to the extent that these tools are all generating text, it might be in person in a focus group, it might be online, it might be a bunch of different places, but eventually it's text, and eventually you're doing language analysis. The depth and detail of that analysis is really the biggest driver of getting that qualitative value you want. So if you have 5 different people talking about why they canceled some streaming subscription, and one of them says because of price, and one says because of inflation, and one says because this is the 5th price increase this year, and the other says because you changed the new policy. A very superficial labeling of that data would maybe aggregate a couple of those and say, people are canceling because of price concerns. A much more detailed and nuanced language analysis would say, actually, there's some different themes here. One has to do with it being too expensive. Another has to do with price fatigue because we're changing preferences so frequently. And a third one has to do with external economic factors, including inflation, right? So that much more detailed analysis leads you to much more actionable hypotheses, like, is it that our prices are actually too high, or is it that we're changing them too frequently and fatiguing our users? You get that level of actionability because of the detail of the language analysis. And so different approaches that we're going to look at lend themselves to more careful or less careful language analysis that then leads to more nuanced and more detailed takeaways as a result, right? So that's number one. How deeply are we able to really analyze this qualitative data that we're getting? The next one is how dynamic. So one of the things that a lot of researchers really like about something like a focus group is the ability to probe in real time. And so someone says something, you say, well, that's interesting. That kind of blows my mind. I can ask a follow-up question. I can get more depth, and I can craft that follow-up question based on what the person just said, right? So that's what we mean by how dynamic is how quickly and agile can a researcher adapt their questions and their probing based on what's coming up in the data. The third point here really moves into the scale benefits, and is really actually the antithesis of the dynamic value, which is how consistent is it? Because we need consistency. We need every person answering the exact same prompt in order to be able to have that confidence and frequency. So I need 10,000 people in my churn data, or 1,000 or 500, all answering the exact same "why did you cancel" question in order to be able to say with some confidence what the exact percentage of reason or rationale for canceling is across our subscriber base. Similarly, in a market research context, right? So consistency gives us that ability to analyze frequency with confidence. The fourth, then, of course, is scalability. Some tools are just better suited to sort of the lower end of what I mentioned, something like 50 or a few hundred responses. Some can go up to hundreds of thousands. And then, of course, speed. We define as just end to end. So really from setup through to insight. and we'll give you a sense of that. It really does depend on your implementation. We're not going to talk about cost here because it really does depend on vendors, but I'm happy to talk about it at the end. There's definitely a cost component in terms of bang for buck here, because some of these approaches that we're going to show can be quite costly, some can be quite efficient. So happy to talk about that if folks have questions. So let's go ahead and dive into the top approaches that we have here. We're going to look at 5 different ones. And I'm going to go somewhat quickly so we can look at some of the trends. I'm going to start pretty simply. So probably the most frequent thing that we see people doing in terms of moving towards more scaled qual is doing more focus groups. This might seem obvious, but there's a couple of reasons driving this. One, cheaper online offerings enabling this. 2, AI transcription of multiple focus groups enables a sense of, hey, we can sort of compile all of this data in some form or fashion. And so this, on top of the fact that tools like Zoom and others really enable people to run their own focus groups as well. So all these trends are pushing people towards doing, instead of 1 or 2, maybe 5 or 8 or even 10 focus groups. And the idea here is like, hey, maybe we can stack up a large enough sample. Maybe we can get to 50 or 100 participants instead of 5 or 10. So the pros of this kind of approach are, of course, you're going to have a ton of opportunity for dynamic probing. In my view, that's the best thing about a focus group, is you can respond in real time. Of course, you have a discussion guide, but this leads us to the necessary con of something like doing lots of focus groups, is that each focus group is going to have a uniquely branching conversation. That's what's great about dynamic prompting, but it means that you can't really aggregate them very easily. You don't have most respondents responding to most questions in an identical manner. And so that means it's really difficult to analyze. I would say really pretty much impossible to meaningfully say, what's the frequency of any one theme coming up? In my view, this means at the end of the day, this leads towards really, you're getting most of the qual approaches. You're not really getting most of the scale volume, even if you keep doing more focus groups. Just to tick through our metrics here, I would say the depth here can be high to very high with careful analysis. This really depends on how you're analyzing those transcripts, though. Unfortunately, I know a lot of folks who do a lot of focus groups, generate a bunch of text, are overwhelmed by it, and aren't really able to analyze it carefully, in which case I would say this depth metric really goes down. So this is kind of a best case scenario where you really are able to carefully review those transcripts and work through them. Of course, the dynamic nature of them, it really as high as it gets. That's the best thing about it. The consistency, very low because of the branching nature of those questions. Scalability, I would say relatively low. Even if you do a relatively large number of these, you're not going to get to an especially large sample. And in terms of lead time, I would say something like weeks to months. Weeks is maybe a bit optimistic. If you have access to users directly, more likely you're looking at a few months to recruit, schedule, and hold these kinds of things. So that's maybe our simplest way of scaling qual, to say, take our most common instrument, a focus group, let's do more of them because online and digital tools have made it cheaper, more accessible, and that would be that one. The next one starts getting a bit fancier here from an AI and tooling standpoint, which is what I would describe as one big focus group all at once in real time. So there are a few platforms that specialize with this. The most well-known is Remesh. There's another called Thought Exchange that's a little different, but I would put in the same category. And there's a few others. The idea of this kind of platform is, hey, what if we could get, say, 200 people all on a platform all at once? And then you, the researcher, can ask a question. It can be a closed-ended, but particularly an open-ended question, just like a focus group. Ask a question. All the respondents on the other side type in their answers. They then use generative AI to summarize all those answers, condense them down into a short little paragraph for the researcher to review that says, hey, you asked what people like about this product, and they mentioned the comfort and the price and the style. And so this approximates something like a large-scale focus group. And the best thing about it is that ability to probe in real time. So it's one of the few relatively scalable approaches that also allows for dynamic probing driven by a human researcher. So that's really cool. The downside to it is that real-time summarization, where you're taking, 200, 500 real-time responses in text and quickly condensing them down into a summary for the researcher, is necessarily very abstract. You end up getting sort of high-level takeaways. There's a bunch of technical reasons. I'm happy to talk about why that's the case. But what it means is that you actually end up getting a more superficial analysis than you might think. You're sort of going into this saying like, hey, we're going to get Qual-at-Scale, and you really end up getting like pretty superficial text analysis because it has to happen so darn fast. and because of the way that it's condensing down to a very short takeaway. So as a result, I would say the depth actually ends up being relatively low. The dynamic nature is medium to high. I'm saying medium here because the researcher is responding to an abstract summary. So you're not really able to say, ooh, that really particular nugget someone said in the Facebook group, I'm going to double down on that. You're responding to a more abstract summary. So I'd put it in the medium category. Your scalability is definitely higher than stacking up a bunch of focus groups. These are relatively costly because you have to get a bunch of people online at the same time. So we see people typically running them with samples around 250. We have seen larger, but you're looking at something like that typically for a sample size. And the time really depends on recruitment. If it's a specialized audience, it can take a long time, especially to get everyone on the platform at the same time, can be a real constraint. But you do get that dynamic ability to ask and react to people in real time at a relatively large scale. The third one, going deeper down the AI rabbit hole here, is automated interviews. So here we're looking at, probably the emerging startup here, emphasis on emerging, might be Outset. There's a couple others. The idea here is to replace a human interview with generative AI. So the ideal scenario is that a researcher basically writes a questionnaire, provides that to an AI, and the AI then has text-based conversations with a set of respondents and asks them what their responses are, and you get sort of a dynamic probing is the ideal here. So respondent says, I didn't like pricing and I had a really bad experience with your product. And in an ideal scenario, the AI interview follows up and says, hey, could you tell me more about the bad experience you had with the product? And so the ideal scenario here is that you could scale interviews faster and cheaper than doing with humans, for sure. The con, I think, are really twofold. One is the AI, as good as it may be, is not going to probe where a human researcher would. One of the things human researchers are the best at is the strategic intuition of what threads to follow, where to really probe and get more detail. And so it's going to miss some of those opportunities, and it might probe in some places you might not expect or want. So not the best follow-up probing. The other side is that, very similar to a focus group, it's going to generate wildly branching different conversations. So each person that has this really dynamic interview is going to, just like an in-person interview, have a completely unique conversation, even if maybe 5 or 10 initial prompts are provided. From there, each conversation really kind of turns into its own unique snowflake. What that means is that when you aggregate all the data together, again, just like a focus group, you don't have everyone consistently responding to exactly the same prompt most of the time. And so that aggregate analysis, being able to understand frequency at scale, just really isn't there. Instead, you're getting dynamic prompting, which is valuable in its own right. And your trade-off is you're not getting that consistency. That's really what you want from scale. So in terms of depth, I would say this is a sort of a medium approach, somewhat like the sort of large focus group all at once. It does depend on the text analysis you're using for these outputs. If you do a really good job, maybe you can get a little bit higher. Dynamic, again, I would say medium to high, depending on how good your AI is at prompting and digging deeper into the right areas. Again, consistency, if you are really asking the AI to probe a lot, you are going to get low consistency. You could maybe strike sort of a medium balance, probe a little bit, have a little more consistency, a little bit better ability to aggregate the results, but at best, you're going to get to a middle ground. In terms of scale, in principle, this can go larger. We'll look at that application in a second, but what we see is most people are doing relatively specialized targeted interviews with this kind of tool. And so they're doing something like maybe 10 or 15 interviews, which again saves the human researcher a ton of time and therefore saves cost. But they're typically not using this approach for hundreds or thousands of interviewees, given the cost requirements of doing so. In terms of lead time, if you've got the system all spun up and you've got interviewees in front of you, maybe days, more likely you're looking at weeks or months, depending on recruitment, to be able to do this. The fourth one is really sort of taking the same concept and applying it to a more scalable survey. So for the purpose of this conversation, we're calling this conversational surveys. Now, this is a term that has been used a few different ways in the history of research tech. So I just want to be specific what we mean here. This is a survey in which there's an open end, and then there is dynamic follow-ups. So just like with the interview setting, you can have an AI ask someone to tell you more about what came up in an initial open end and to probe deeper and deeper. They can also do that after closed ends as well. So it's really, again, using AI to generate unique follow-up prompts based on answers within a given survey. So again, the pro here is potentially dynamic prompting at a really large scale. So if you could, in theory, implement this, in an enterprise churn survey that's doing tens of thousands of responses a month, and dynamically probe for why people are canceling, right? That could be a potential application here. You also could do it at a more normal scale as well. The con here is, again, relatively low consistency can make them hard to analyze at scale. So the more you enable the system to take the conversation in different ways, the more you're getting that unique following of threads. But what you're sacrificing is the fact that each respondent is no longer actually having the same prompt asked of them. And so again, you're going to have a difficult time aggregating that data set. And that will just fundamentally undermine really what you're after in terms of scale. So in terms of depth, I would say low to medium. Really depends, though, on the text analysis that you're using. If you used really high quality text analysis, I would say you could definitely get pretty solid insights here. It can be very dynamic, but the consistency is low. So you're not going to be able to aggregate this very effectively. Scalability potentially very high, although there can be significant costs associated with it. And in terms of speed, if you've got this set up already, it runs about as fast as a survey. So depending on your recruitment and fielding approach, if you're running this in-house to an enterprise, it can be days. If you're recruiting a field sample, maybe you're getting into weeks. Finally, want to close on what is really, in some ways, a traditional approach, but one that has not been used as much until recently, which are what we call mixed method surveys. So this is a survey, could be fielded any of the ways that we field surveys, and it includes closed-ended questions as well as well-crafted open ends. Those open ends might stand on their own. How do you feel about this product? They might be well-crafted branched follow-ups. Would you recommend this product or not? Branching into, tell me more about why not, tell me more about why. You can get sort of very simple or very sophisticated in this. But at the end of the day, you're looking at a survey that has open ends that are going to be asked the same of every respondent in a given branch. And that then the pros here are that, one, you can get very high depth with careful text analysis. A well-written open end will reveal a surprising amount of nuance and depth if you crafted it well. And because you're getting a very large sample of people answering the same prompt, you can analyze it in aggregate. You can get that sense of consistency. You can say, okay, among the promoters for my product, here are the reasons why. Here's how they're reacting to it. Here's how they feel about it. They all got the same set of prompts. I can cut over and say, okay, among my detractors, what are the reasons for that? The one con to this approach is that you're only able to change your prompts between waves, right? So by definition, it's not dynamic. And so that means you are sort of looking at your data from one wave saying, oh, hey, there's something interesting here. Maybe we want to dig into that with interviews or to change the next wave of the survey or that kind of thing. So that's the sacrifice. No ability to have dynamic prompting, but very high depth, very high consistency, very high scalability. And the speed here can also be just as fast as any survey. And in terms of tooling, you can implement this in any survey tool that you might have combined with a good high quality text analytics solution. So these are the 5 approaches that we are seeing most frequently. As you may have heard as we were going through this, in my opinion, there's really a core trade-off here that really ought to push you towards one category or another of these kinds of approaches. It really comes down to how much do you value the ability to dynamically probe on the fly, the ability to hear something come from a respondent and in real time respond and ask them to go deeper on a given thread. If that's really important to you, then you're necessarily going to be sacrificing a lot of the benefits of scale that come from consistency. But that might be worth it, right? In which case, there's a certain set of tools that are going to be useful. On the other hand, if what you really want from Qual-at-Scale is that scale piece, that ability to say with confidence, this is what's coming up in an open-ended format in a qualitative way from a representative sample of our users or respondents or Americans, as the case may be, then you're going to be looking at a different set of tools. And the trade-off there is the dynamic prompting is not going to be within any one instrument. Instead, it will have to be between instruments. But what you will get is that ability to have much higher confidence in the frequency of the themes within the population that you are identifying. So this is a simplification of some deeper evaluation that we did of these. But one way that might be helpful to think about this is to put these on an axis of the benefits of depth versus the benefits of scale. So when we talk about the benefits of depth, we are looking at detail and nuance, the ability to parse, specific depths of different language that people are talking about, the ability to understand the why, and the ability to dynamically prompt. When we were talking about the benefits of scale, that's of course speed and how scalable it can be, but it's also that consistency piece. How much are respondents responding to the exact same prompt, which then lets you aggregate those responses and analyze them in a meaningful way. And so in our view, what you see here is basically a rough curve that is basically a trade-off between being able to dynamically prompt or not, between most of the approaches that we looked at here, where you're able to get a ton of depth, and if you're doing careful language analysis, as well as dynamic prompting with things like focus groups. As we move sort of to the right here, we start getting a little bit more scalability, and we start sacrificing depth of language analysis as we sort of move down this curve. And in our view, the mixed method surveys really stand out as something that is sort of on a different curve of its own. There's one sacrifice in terms of depth, which is you're not able to do dynamic prompting on the fly, but you're still getting all the other types of ability to do nuanced open-ended analysis, dig deeply into the why, and you get all the benefits of a quant-only survey in terms of the ability to have a rigorous understanding of the frequency of themes, to be able to do subset analysis and other types of more rigorous quant analysis on top of your labeled data as well. So from our perspective, I mentioned at the top of this, Tova and I built a whole other company before this, the number one goal of which was to deliver the depth of a focus group at the scale of a poll, to provide deep insights at scale. And we tried a ton of tools. What we ended up doing 99% of the time were mixed method surveys. And the reasons for that are, what we have talked through here. One, dynamic prompting can seem really cool, but the fact that it undermines your consistency in terms of respondents responding to the same prompt really undermines pretty much all of the scale value proposition. And so our experience was a mixed method approach in a survey does sacrifice dynamic prompting, but in exchange, you get really deep insight from well-written open ends. And you also have the ability to combine that with other quant data. So this is where it can get really exciting, where you're able to say, okay, I want to look at my open ends as a function of my closed ends. I want to say, okay, across, all of Americans who have a certain perspective on an issue or a candidate or a product or a company, what's the qualitative reasons for those who are supporters versus detractors? Let's then go into within supporters, different demographic or different psychographic segments thereof. Those are the kinds of things you're able to do with a mixed method survey because of the consistency with which it is prompting every respondent that you're just not able to do with anything else. And finally, our experience with this is it just provides tremendous value relative to cost. So the cost of doing this, compared to something like getting hundreds of people on the same platform at the same time for a dynamic conversation is a fraction of that to be doing this kind of mixed method approach. Finally, we found that it can be a really good sort of bedrock and foundation of an overall research strategy. So it's not to say that you might not find times where you say, hey, something's coming up in our open ends. We're looking at churn data or we're looking at brand awareness data and we're seeing this new thing trending. We don't really understand it. Let's get together a focus group. Let's do some user interviews. Let's dig more deeply into that. So those other, more qual forward approaches can be a really good complement to this. And there's really no reason that we ought not be injecting more open ends into pretty much all of our surveys now that there are very high quality text analysis solutions. For so long, we didn't do that because, quite frankly, making sense of hundreds, thousands, let alone tens of thousands of open ends was a complete nightmare, or it was giving us very superficial and poor level of analysis. But now with tools like Fathom, you're able to get much deeper insights at scale from your open ends. And there's no reason not to just be putting that into all of your surveys and getting the benefits of qual at the scale of your quant instruments at the same time. So given all of that, I'm excited that we wrapped up with a good amount of time and would love to hear what questions folks might have.